What is up, Iwu crew? Today we have an incredible story for you about a man considered by most to be a criminal who committed one of the most atrocious and shocking crimes, but who today is also hailed by some as a folk hero. We are taking a look at the stomach-turning tale of Alferd Packer, more commonly known as the Colorado Cannibal. Our story begins all the way back in the 1870s, during the period of the gold rush, where greed and desperation for success convinced many to risk their lives, but few went to the same dark and disturbing lengths as Alferd. Born in 1842, Alferd Packer lived in the area of Minnesota, where he worked as a shoemaker before he joined the Union Army in 1862. Though a soldier in the American Civil War, he barely served as he suffered from debilitating epilepsy, resulting in his honorable discharge. After only 8 months in the Army, Alferd wasn't dissuaded, however, and he soon moved south to Iowa in order to join a Union cavalry regiment and serve in the war. This perseverance would be a marker of his personality and something that would push him to commit the unsavory deeds that would end up saving his life. However, Alferd was ultimately discharged again as his epilepsy caused seizures that could occur as often as every 2 days, making it impossible for the Army to ignore. After realizing he wouldn't be able to serve during the Civil War, Alferd traveled around the western United States, picking up random jobs when they became available. Some of the positions he worked in included as a hunter, wagon teamster, field worker, a ranch hand, a miner, and eventually even a guide. Alferd was never in any of these positions for long, as he was said to have an unpleasant attitude, likely as a result of a known difficult relationship with his father. As well, most of the people who met or worked with Alferd agreed that he was disagreeable, and he was almost universally disliked. His employers didn't trust him, and some even accused him of stealing. He was also said to be a near-constant liar. Coupled with his epilepsy, he was frequently changing jobs. After moving between positions as a miner in the Colorado area, he eventually moved to Utah to work in the mines near Salt Lake City. He spent a short time there before he heard about a massive worker strike back in Breckenridge, Colorado. In November 1873, Alferd met up with a group of men near Provo who had joined together to travel into Colorado to Breckenridge, where they expected to make a great deal of money by filling in for the labor shortage in the mines and gold fields. The men in the group of about 20 told Alferd that they were heading into the San Juan Mountains, an area notorious for deposits of gold. It was after hearing this that Alferd decided that he wanted to join the men on their journey, but he had met them without any money or supplies to make the expedition, which made many of the men hesitant to allow him to accompany them. Still, though, Alferd claimed that since he had previously been in Colorado, he was familiar with the territory and had even worked as a guide, as well as claiming that he had experience working as both a gold and silver prospector. His claim to be a prospector was likely a lie, or at the least an exaggeration, but he had technically worked previously as a guide, for however short a time that may have been. Something that would later become ironic is that during his brief time working as a guide in the past, he was known to struggle and frequently lose his way. Despite their initial reservations, the men allowed Alferd to join them, as they needed someone who could guide them through unknown terrain. And as a prospector, he offered them the opportunity to make even more money than they expected. However, many of the men were again wary when he showed up with only a Colt revolver with him, and not even a rifle to help with any of the hunting that would be required to provide food during the trip. Regardless, the group set off, following Alferd's lead. As their journey continued, though, many of the men came to regard him as a whining fraud, especially as they had a difficult time traveling and made very little progress. The biggest obstacle soon became the weather, as they were traveling just as winter was approaching, and their horse-drawn wagons struggled to make it through the territory. Though this was out of Alferd's control, many of the men in the group believed that he had led them into the difficult territory of the Mormon Trail that was only made harder to travel by the growing snow. Soon their path was indistinguishable because of the heavy snowfalls, which may not have been an issue for a seasoned guide. But Alferd had no real experience, and soon the group was completely lost. They relied on only a compass, which ultimately led them farther off of their desired path. As provisions ran short and the harsh winter settled in around them, the doomed group had to resort to eating the horses' feed, as they couldn't find or hunt anything else to provide sustenance. The group soon turned on Alferd, who they saw as being lazy and greedy with the little rations they had. In addition, his frequent seizures only hindered their relationship and increased the tension between the men. They managed to survive for quite some time on just the horse feed, trekking through endless snowstorms. But when that ran out as well, the men had to resort to eating some of their horses and abandoning a few of their wagons. By the end of January 1874, the men's luck appeared to be turning around when they accidentally happened across the encampment of the indigenous chief Ouray, who was the leader of the Ute tribe near Montrose, Colorado. Though Chief Ouray was commonly known as the white man's friend, the desperate men were still hesitant when approaching the camp, as they weren't sure whether they would be welcomed or seen as trespassers. Reportedly, the men appeared to be so gaunt and haggard from their hard travels that they actually scared a few members of the tribe when they appeared. But Chief Ouray quickly welcomed them in. He generously offered the group much-needed food and lodgings. After hearing about their previously troubled journey, Chief Ouray warned that the men should abandon their hope to traverse the mountains in the winter, and even cautioned them that he believed it would be almost certain death to even try. Extending his hospitality and kindness far beyond what the men ever expected, Chief Ouray offered that they could stay at his camp until the spring, when it would be safe for them to continue. Though a few of the group were thrilled to hear that they wouldn't have to fight their way through the treacherous winter mountains, a few, including Alferd, were anxious that they would miss their chance at the riches in Breckenridge, especially as they were sure other miners were also on their way. After only a few weeks recovering at the camp, the men met up and discussed their plans. 11 decided they would risk their lives and continue on, disregarding Chief Ouray's warning, while the others elected to stay and continue after them in the spring with the rest of the horses and wagons. The party soon split up, and the group who left were gifted provisions by Chief Ouray, along with clear directions to guide them to the Los Pinos Indian Agency, which was the only outpost near the Ute tribe camp. After stopping at the agency, they would head to Breckenridge. However, almost immediately upon leaving the camp, divisions and disagreements struck between the 11 men, fueled by Alferd. Though he had no real experience in the area, Alferd went against the directions given to them by Chief Ouray and wanted to lead the men straight through the mountains to the agency, because for some reason, he believed it was the more direct route. 5 of the men disagreed with him and wanted to stick with Chief Ouray's directions that would guide them along the Gunnison River, as he knew and lived in the area. Alferd, though, often the source of derision in the group, managed to convince 5 of the 11 men that he knew the territory better and that his chosen path would be quicker. The 5 men with Alferd were Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Butcher Miller, George California Noon, and Israel Swan. The other 5 men departed, likely happy to be rid of their inexperienced guide, certain that they were going to find their way without him. Their own journey was arduous, but nothing compared to what Alferd and his men would encounter. Still, this group barely survived the winter weather, plunging temperatures, and lack of provisions. Just as they were nearing starvation, they would be fortuitously found by cowhands from the government cattle camp near Gunnison. They stayed there until the spring. Alferd's group wouldn't be so lucky. No one could have predicted the dark and twisted turns their journey would take. Unknowingly, Alferd had chosen a grueling 75-mile trek for his group to undertake, but they only had enough supplies to last for 14 days. Though it was deep winter when they split from the other group, Alferd and his 5 men had no flint to make fire, only a small number of matches, no snowshoes, and no clothing appropriate for the freezing temperatures. The only weapons they brought were 2 rifles, a pistol, a few knives, and a hatchet. Though they started along the river route that Chief Urey had given them, Alferd soon led them up into the San Juan Mountains. It is a mystery exactly what happened after this point. It wasn't until April 16, 1874, 2 months later, that there was any sign of Alferd and his group. Men at the Los Pinos Indian Agency were just sitting down in their mess hall to eat breakfast when they looked up to see a haggard Alferd stumbling out of the woods to shove open their door. He was completely alone, with no sign of the 5 other men who had been with him. Shocked at his unexpected appearance, the men of the agency ushered him into the warmth of the hall. They tried to give him food, but he threw it all up as he ate, which was a normal occurrence when someone had suffered from near starvation, as it appeared that Alferd had. The men of the agency noted that all he had with him was a rifle, a knife, a satchel, a steel coffee pot, and rags tied to his feet. At first glance, he looked as though he had barely made it out of the woods alive. Once he was warm and had put back a few sips of whiskey, Alferd began to share his harrowing story of being hired as a guide to Breckenridge. He said that the group had gone snowblind during a blizzard, resulting in them getting lost. In frustration and anger, the men abandoned him, and he claimed they went their separate ways. He only had the rifle from Israel Swan to hunt with, but very little ammunition. Alferd told the men that he had survived on roots and rosebuds for the entire 2 months he was alone. But the men of the agency noted that although he looked worse for wear, his face was bloated, and his body was certainly not as skeletal as any of the other people they had seen, who had also gotten lost in the treacherous mountains. Alferd stayed at the agency for only 10 days before he told them he wanted to leave and start to make his way home. Before departing, he stated he was broke and sold the rifle for $10 to help fund his return trip. Yet when he arrived at the nearby town of Saguache, Alferd took up a room in a saloon owned by Larry Dolan, who said that he spent around $100 gathering supplies for his journey home, which is around $2,300 in today's currency. He allegedly also offered to lend Dolan $300 and spend another $78 at a general store. The question then was, where did Alferd come across so much money while he was struggling to survive in the mountains? Alferd was also witnessed using multiple different wallets when he paid for his many drinks, as he was seen getting drunk every day. The many drinks also appeared to loosen his tongue, as Alferd soon was sharing conflicting tales of his fight for survival. Some of those in town were starting to become concerned that no one else had come across any sign of the other 5 members of the group, especially since it didn't appear that Alferd was running out of money. Just as gossip was spreading, Preston Nutter arrived in Saguache, along with 2 other members of the original group who stayed behind with Chief Urey until it was safe to continue travel in the spring. Nutter found Alferd as he was once again sharing his incredible tale at the saloon, and he interrogated him about the whereabouts of the rest of the group. Sticking more to his original tale, Alferd told Nutter that he had got his feet wet and frozen, and to warm up he had built a fire at a camp just as a storm blew in. He said that the other men had left him at the camp to seek out food, and that they never returned. Alferd claimed that they abandoned him, and that he eventually gave up his search and moved on without them. But Nutter was still suspicious. Not only did the locals tell him that Alferd frequently changed his story, but it didn't make sense that the men would leave behind the other rifle if they were going hunting, or that they would abandon the one person who claimed to have knowledge of the area. Nutter continued to ask Alferd questions he refused to answer, such as where had his money come from, where did his Colt revolver go, and how had he ended up with Frank Butcher Miller's skinning knife. The two started an enormous fight, which culminated in Nutter threatening to hang Alferd. Nutter later described Alferd at the saloon as sulky, obstinate, and quarrelsome. He was a petty thief willing to take things that did not belong to him, whether of any value or not. While this was happening in Saguache, the other group that had split from Alferd's after leaving Chief Ure finally arrived at the Los Pinos Indian Agency. General Adams, who ran the agency, greeted the men and informed them that he had met another member of their group, Alferd, but that he had been abandoned by the others. Oliver Lautzenheiser was alarmed to hear of this development and immediately told General Adams not to trust Alferd. He explained that Alferd was a liar and that the other men were too honorable and would never have left him behind. Lautzenheiser soon asked the general to investigate. Coupled with the fact that Alferd had arrived with another man's rifle and had left behind a pipe at the agency that had belonged to Shannon Bell, General Adams was instantly suspicious of Alferd. An officer was sent to Saguache to apprehend Alferd and bring him in for questioning. The officer arrived just in time to stop Nutter from attacking Alferd as he was attempting to leave. The officer lied and claimed that he was there to retrieve Alferd to help guide a search party attempting to find the missing men. And Alferd agreed to help, mostly to escape any more confrontation with Nutter. When back at the agency, Alferd maintained his story and his innocent explanations of how he came to own the items from the lost men. But the story soon crumbled as General Adams and the 5 miners, including Nutter and Lautzenheiser, convened to interrogate him. Just as they began, 2 men from the Ute tribe rushed into the agency, waving around what they said was white man's meat. They appeared to be holding strips of dried human skin. Soon, the twisted and sick story of what happened to the other men with Alferd was revealed. At the sight of the human skin, Alferd fainted, and when he came to, he instantly began sobbing and begging for mercy, telling General Adams it would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry. Alferd finally shared the gruesome fate of the 5 men who had been with him in the mountains. They had quickly run out of food after splitting from the other 5, and game was scarce due to the growing winter storms. As they grew hungrier, they had to resort to boiling their moccasins to eat. Alferd claimed that their hunger had changed them and made the men begin to start eyeing each other in an unsettling way. He said that when he returned after gathering firewood, he discovered that 4 of the men had murdered Israel Swan and were butchering his body. As he himself was near starvation, Alferd said that he joined them, and as there was no other choice, he was forced to eat Swan. Together, the men consumed Swan's body. However, their gruesome and stomach-turning solution to their hunger didn't last for long, and within 2 days they were once again out of meat. Alferd stated that Bell, Humphrey, and Noon decided that Miller had to be killed next, and sacrificed for the survival of the rest, as he was a large man and would sustain them for longer. Miller was killed by a blow to the head with a hatchet, and then the men butchered him, just as they had with Swan, each consuming his flesh in order to survive without any other food. Alferd said the men continued on their journey, but it wasn't long until Humphrey was brutally killed to feed the others, followed by Noon, leaving just Alferd and Bell alive. After the sickening killing and eating of the other men, Alferd said that they each swore not to ever speak of their choice to resort to cannibalism, and not to turn on each other. They agreed to tell everyone that the others had died naturally from the rough elements. They also took all of the other men's money and supplies. Though Alferd and Bell survived a few weeks longer, they too ran out of food and only found roots and a single rabbit to survive on. Alferd said that Bell soon snapped and tried to kill him, attempting to bash in his head with the end of his rifle. Alferd claimed he had no choice but to defend himself, and so he fought off Bell, the fight only ending when Alferd struck him in the head with the hatchet. Alferd saw no other choice but to also butcher and eat Bell to survive the rest of his journey. He even packed up pieces of his body, which he carried with him until he came across the Los Pinos Indian Agency, where he threw away the evidence of his sick crime, hoping that an animal would eat the human flesh, and no one would ever know. It was likely these pieces of skin that the Ute tribe members had come across. Most disturbingly, Alferd admitted that he didn't actually want to throw away the remains of Bell, because in those 2 months of surviving on human flesh alone, he had grown fond of the taste. He even remarked that the most delicious piece of the human body was around the chest. A search party attempting to find the men's bodies was sent out, but Alferd was in the lead, and he took them in circles, claiming that he didn't recognize any of the area. Lautzenheiser had grown tired of Alferd and once again insisted he be hanged, this time for admitting to murder. However, due to a technicality, Alferd was saved from being hanged, and to the dismay and shock of the nation, his sentence was overturned. As soon as he was there, he retracted his story about the men killing each other, stating instead that they had mutually agreed to eat anyone who died of exposure, which he claimed most of the men did. However, it was too late. The shocking story had already spread. John A. Randolph, an illustrator for Harper's Weekly magazine, caught wind of the terrible tale and set out to find evidence of what really occurred. Following the horrible, putrid smell of death, he discovered all 5 bodies in Slumgullion Pass, Colorado, just above Lake Fork. Sadly, the men were quite near Lake City and would have all easily made it to salvation if they had only known. But as Alferd wasn't a real guide, he didn't know where they were or just how close the city was. Randolph made a sketch of the bodies, noting that there appeared to be evidence of extreme violence. Authorities soon arrived to investigate and found that Frank Miller's head was missing from the site, supposedly taken by an animal, and Israel Swan's skull had been bashed in and was missing a portion of it. In fact, almost all of the skulls showed evidence of some kind of trauma, and it was assumed that the injuries were likely caused by a hatchet. Unnervingly, Shannon Bell, George Noon, and James Humphrey's bodies were skeletal from the waist down, with flayed torsos, but their faces were somewhat preserved, with their bushy beards still visible. Bell in particular didn't appear to be that decomposed. All of the bodies showed evidence of being sloppily butchered and skinned. It was concluded that Swan's body had evidence of a struggle, but all of the other men appeared to have been killed as they slept. Immediately, the investigators noted that the fact that the bodies were concentrated together meant that Alferd had lied about both versions of his story. They came to the sickening conclusion that Alferd killed all of them before the supplies ever ran low, made a shelter nearby, and over the 2 months he returned to the site to cut off parts of their bodies to consume. Just before the news of the butchered bodies made it to the Saguache jail, Alferd escaped. Popular opinion says that he managed to get away the same month that the bodies were found, or even the same day, but this isn't known for sure. A conspiracy was spread that his guard had been bribed to let him go, either by Alferd or someone sympathetic to him. As the bodies hadn't been found yet, many believed that he had been the survivor and victim of an unfortunate accident. But that hadn't been the case at all. The story made national headlines, and the entire U.S. was captivated by the shocking tale of survival, death, and disturbing cannibalism. Some people even believe that Alferd had always intended to lead the men into the wilderness, with the plan to murder and steal from them. What may come as a surprise to a modern audience is that many people at the time weren't particularly offended by Alferd's cannibalism, but more upset that he had stolen from men who trusted him and led them knowing he was incompetent. At the time, people were familiar with the horror story of the Donner Party, and so resorting to cannibalism during dire circumstances was not unheard of. Alferd remained on the run until 1883, when 9 years later he was captured by chance in Wyoming, living under the alias John Schwartz, the name of one of the men in the original group who had stayed with Chief Urey. Alferd claimed he only escaped from jail because he was afraid of being killed by vigilantes. He was then put on trial in Lake City for his crimes. Once again, Alferd changed his story, now blaming all of the murders on Bell, who he said killed everyone and then attacked him. Alferd said he only killed Bell in self-defense. He pleaded not guilty during his trial, and in a statement he described, "I tried to get away every day, but could not, so I lived off the flesh of these men, the bigger part of 60 days. Despite his protestations, Alferd was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan and sentenced to death. Larry Dolan, the owner of the saloon where Alferd stayed, gave a comment to the local newspaper, explaining that the presiding judge in court had spoken, "Packer, you Republican cannibal, I would sentence you to hell, but the statutes forbid it." The judge has also famously been quoted as uttering, "Damn you, Alferd Packer. There were 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, and you ate 5 of them." It is clear that this judge fostered no sympathy for Alferd in the slightest, and he later told the man that he'd hang, quote, "by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead." According to reports from locals, the townspeople were eerily excited to attend the hanging, and they apparently even ordered lumber to build the gallows and sent out invitations for the event. One man said, "You'd pack up your kids and have a picnic lunch, and for your entertainment, watch Packer meet his just desserts." Alferd was saved from being hanged, and to the dismay and shock of the nation, his sentence was overturned. However, he was quickly brought to a second trial, this time for culpability for the 5 men's deaths, to which he again pleaded not guilty, and maintained he had only ever killed Bell in self-defense. It was during these proceedings that local hunters were brought in to testify, and all gave statements claiming that Alferd had no need to resort to cannibalism, because even though the winter was extremely harsh, deer and other wild game were in abundance in the area. Allegedly, a deer carcass was even found nearby to the bodies of the men he killed. After a whirlwind court case, Alferd was finally found guilty of voluntary manslaughter for each of the men, and was sentenced to the longest judicial sentence in U.S. history at the time, 40 years. He was never actually convicted of cannibalism, as it is not technically illegal in the U.S. Many would assume that Alferd's story ended here, but he was eventually released on parole after serving 18 years of his sentence. A sympathetic campaign had rallied around him, which cast him as the victim of unfortunate circumstances, and their pleas eventually saw him freed. For the rest of his life, Alferd attempted to get a pardon for his crimes in order to clear his name, which he was never granted. Rumors swirled that he had become a vegetarian, likely to soften his reputation as a cannibal. He died from what was described as dementia and trouble and worry, but was likely a stroke in 1907 at the age of 65. Alferd's gruesome tale did not die along with him, and in fact, it continues to fascinate and horrify later generations. Because his story is so popular, his original tombstone was stolen, and his grave had to be cemented over in order to stop vandalism. There is currently a dispute over the fate of Alferd's skull, as the cemetery where he is buried has stated that his remains are intact, but the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum claims to have his dissected head in their possession. Ripley's has said they verified the head as being Alferd's, which was dissected so that his brain could be preserved with arsenic and then studied. His head then apparently became part of a traveling sideshow before Ripley's bought it. As his grave is no longer accessible, we may never know where his skull ended up. Despite being a convicted murderer and self-proclaimed cannibal, Alferd's popularity has only grown since his death. Among many, he is even now regarded as a beloved and infamous folk hero. Alferd Packer has since been featured in books, fictional and non-fictional, comics, musicals, songs, and other areas of popular culture. He was also given a bust in the Colorado State Capitol in 1982, where the cannibal sat among statesmen. Alferd became so popular, there was even a controversy at the University of Colorado Boulder in 1968, when the students named their new cafeteria the Alferd G. Packer Memorial Grill, with the clever and nauseating slogan, "Have a friend for lunch." The university also had Alferd Packer Day, which involved themed contests, including raw meat tossing. Along the same lines of dark humor, a wilderness cookbook has been named after Alferd. The area where the bodies were found is now called Dead Man's Gulch, or Cannibal Plateau by locals, and can be visited along a designated trail. The site is now a tourist attraction for the town of Littleton. In 2019, Littleton hosted an Alferd Packer Cannibal Fast Food 5K 10K Run Walk, which went by his grave. For forensic scientists and historians, many questions still remain around Alferd's story. In 1989, 1994, and 2001, the remains of the 5 men in his group were examined to find definitive proof of how they had died. The goal had been to determine which version of Alferd's tale had been true. Had he killed the men in their sleep and robbed them? Or did Bell actually kill the men as Alferd claimed? And did he kill Bell in self-defense? Unfortunately, skeletal remains can only reveal so much. The studies did find evidence on the bones of defleshing and hacking trauma, often taken as a sign of cannibalism, though it has also been verified that Bell was shot. Not much else can be said for certain. The evidence appears to support that all the men were killed at once, likely bludgeoned in their sleep, except for Bell, who Alferd shot. The question remains, did Bill kill the men as Alferd's second statement claims, or did Alferd kill them all in a crazed spree? To this day, people debate about which version of Alferd's many stories is the truth, and whether or not he should be remembered as a cold-blooded murderer, or simply a survivor making the best of a truly terrible situation. We may never know what actually happened, but one thing is for certain. Alferd Packer is probably the most well-liked cannibal of all time.